Welcome back to the File X channel.
This is Little Caesar's Pizza. How can I help you?
July 8th, 2003. At a Little Caesar's Pizza store in Centralia, USA, an unusual phone call changed everything. A staff member was taking an order when a faint, broken voice came through the other end of the line. It was a little girl. Her voice trembled, choked with emotion, and interspersed with small sobs. She slowly spelled out each letter of the delivery address, as if every sound she made carried an invisible weight of fear. At first, the staff member thought the girl might have just been scolded or was upset about something, which seemed like a normal occurrence. Who could have imagined that the girl on the other end of the line was battling a true nightmare? Only 9 years old, Jeanette Tamayo was enduring days of abduction, grappling with relentless physical and emotional torment. She had summoned the last bit of courage to make this call, hoping it would become the beacon of hope to rescue her from the dark abyss she was trapped in.
He went downstairs, came back upstairs with the pizza and was standing with the pizza box and was staring at me, and he handed me a flyer.
A 9-year-old girl abducted, the darkest days of her life. Jeanette Tamayo, a little girl with bright, curious eyes, was often teased by her peers with nicknames like Detective Story Fanatic, The Lonely Friend, or The Odd One Out. She was unlike other kids her age. While they were busy playing with dolls or indulging in animated shows, Jeanette was captivated by crime investigation programs. Every case ever broadcast in the United States, whether on TV or online, had caught her inquisitive gaze. Who would have thought that this unusual obsession would one day become her weapon, enabling her to accomplish the unimaginable, something very few her age could achieve? Jeanette grew up in a modest household in California, where peaceful afternoons passed under the warm glow of the sun. After her father's untimely passing, Jeanette lived with her mother and older brother, finding small moments of joy amidst the pain of loss. But that fragile peace was shattered in the most cruel way. On the afternoon of June the 7th, 2003, darkness descended upon Jeanette's life and her family's world forever. A sudden tragedy struck, turning everything familiar into a living nightmare. At just 9 years old, Jeanette was forced to face a horror beyond words. Someone had torn her away from the safety of her family, thrusting her into the darkest days of her life. In the blink of an eye, her world transformed from a tranquil existence into an endless nightmare that seemed to have no escape. The terrifying intrusion. June 7th, 2003. What seemed like an ordinary afternoon turned into a nightmare. Jeanette Tamayo, a 9-year-old girl, was walking home from school. The path was familiar, and nothing seemed out of the ordinary to cause her concern. But the moment she stepped into her beloved home, a sense of unease crept in. The front door was slightly ajar, just a few inches. A strange sight, especially since her mother was still at work and her brother hadn't returned from school yet. Though feeling uneasy, Jeanette tried to calm herself, convincing her young mind that perhaps her mother had come home early to water the plants or take care of something else. But as she stepped inside, the unsettling feeling grew stronger. The house was eerily quiet, an unnatural stillness that made her skin crawl. As she entered her room, her heart dropped. The window was shattered, shards of glass scattered everywhere. Panicked, she dashed to the living room and reached for the phone, intending to call her mother. But her hopes were quickly dashed. The phone line had been cut. A suffocating tension filled the air. Jeanette's small body trembled uncontrollably as the realization dawned upon her. Her young but observant mind, honed by watching countless crime investigation shows, screamed that this was a trap, carefully planned and waiting for her. Suddenly, she caught sight of a shadow moving swiftly behind the curtains. Her voice quivered as she called out, "Who's there? Is that you, Paul?" But it wasn't. From behind the curtain emerged a middle-aged man she had never seen before. His eyes locked onto hers, and a sinister smile spread across his face, a smile brimming with menace and malice. In a calm yet chilling tone, he said, "I've missed you, Jeanette." Jeanette froze. She racked her brain trying to recall this man's face, but no memory surfaced. Who was he? And how did he know her name? Before she could react, the man lunged at her, grabbing her by the hair and dragging her forcefully into her bedroom.
He threw me on the bed and took off my pants.
What followed was a nightmare beyond words. For 2 agonizing hours, Jeanette endured unimaginable torment at the hands of this monster, who wielded strange tools to inflict pain and humiliation upon her. At just 9 years old, she was pushed to the brink of total exhaustion. Her small, fragile legs could no longer hold her up, but the ordeal was far from over. The man showed no intention of stopping. After satisfying his depraved desires, he methodically dressed himself, bound Jeanette's hands and feet, and carried her to his car, parked in the garage. Everything seemed meticulously planned, but fate had other plans. As he struggled with the garage door, which was jammed and wouldn't fully open, another car suddenly pulled into the driveway. From the back seat, Jeanette recognized the car. It was her mother's. Her mother and older brother Paul had unexpectedly returned home early that day. The moment her mother noticed the partially open garage door and the eerie silence, an overwhelming sense of dread took over. She jumped out of the car and crawled under the half-open garage door. Jeanette, overwhelmed by fear and despair, screamed, "Run! Paul, run!" But the man was too close. He grabbed Paul, a skinny 15-year-old boy who stood no chance against a towering, muscular adult. Paul, however, refused to give in. He grabbed a screwdriver and charged at the intruder, but the man swiftly disarmed him, raining punches on the boy until he collapsed. Dragging Paul into the kitchen, the man found himself face to face with Jeanette's mother. Fueled by sheer maternal instinct, she fought with all her might, desperately trying to free her son from the man's grasp. Despite his injuries, Paul managed to crawl to the kitchen counter, grab a frying pan, and launch another attack. But it was futile. The man easily overpowered him, snatching the pan and using it to strike Jeanette's mother repeatedly until she fell to the ground, screaming in pain before collapsing. Jeanette, bound and utterly helpless, could only watch in horror as the chaos unfolded before her. When the man returned to the garage, Jeanette mustered the courage to ask, her voice trembling, Did you kill my mom and my brother?" He didn't answer. Instead, he offered her a cold, cryptic smile, a twisted expression that seemed to savor the terror and devastation he had left in his wake. Jeanette, the harrowing days with the kidnapper. The attacker started driving, accelerating like a madman. Jeanette barely had time to glance back at her house, which was gradually fading into the distance. She felt an overwhelming sense of relief upon seeing her mother rush out of the house and desperately chase after the car. It meant her mother was still alive, despite her face being covered in blood. In the distance, Paul was also limping behind, waving his arms and calling for help. A question that many people wonder about is, we always live with the presence of neighbors. so it's hard to imagine how, when the stranger attacked Jeanette's mother and brother, with all the noise from the struggle, no one nearby could hear or come to their rescue. Even during the 2 hours when Jeanette was assaulted by the perpetrator, she screamed in agony. Yet not a single neighbor around saw or stepped in to help or serve as a witness. Of course, there was someone, and coincidentally, the witness happened to be the boy next door, the very one Jeanette had a crush on. He had filmed the scene of her being sexually assaulted by the criminal. With such a video, the perpetrator should have been caught. However, unfortunately, the boy next door did not provide the video to the police because he didn't record the video to catch the criminal. What was the real reason behind this? In the end, no one could ever truly understand. Returning to the unfortunate girl, Jeanette. As soon as the car reached a curve, Jeanette began shouting loudly toward a car that passed by, banging her shoulder against the window in an attempt to draw attention and get help from someone. But it was all in vain. Instead, the vile man turned around and brutally attacked her with a screwdriver, causing her to collapse in pain. The 9-year-old Jeanette must have been in immense pain and fear, utterly hopeless as she watched her mother and brother being overpowered, while she herself had become the possession of a malicious stranger. Jeanette drifted into a haze, but knew she would have to awaken again to face even more terrifying ordeals from this wicked kidnapper, a seemingly endless journey of torment. The account of a girl who was abducted at just 9 years old has become a haunting memory for both her family and the police involved in the case. In that unfamiliar car, Jeanette was filled with despair, fully understanding that she might not have much time left to live. But could a miracle happen? Or would the police manage to find this poor little girl? Showerhead, a fragile refuge in the nightmare. The car stopped in front of a small white-painted house, nestled deep in the desolate outskirts. The criminal opened the car door and yanked Jeanette out with enough force to make her stumble and almost fall. Despite being exhausted and in pain from everything she had endured, Jeanette still tried to look around, holding on to the faint hope that someone might see her. But no, there was no one. No sounds except for the persistent hum of insects. The abductor dragged her into the house and up the creaky wooden stairs, each step groaning under his weight. The dark staircase seemed to stretch on endlessly, each step fueling Jeanette's growing fear. Once they reached the second floor, he stopped in front of a weathered door, pushing it open with a hard shove. The door creaked, revealing an old, dilapidated room. Inside, the room was simple, yet chilling in its desolation. A small bed pressed against the wall, its rumpled blanket tossed haphazardly, as if untouched for a long time. In one corner, an old, dusty television sat, its screen clouded with grime. The only light came from a small window, but all that could be seen outside was darkness. Jeanette was dragged into the room and roughly thrown onto the floor. The door slammed shut behind her, and the sound of the lock clicking into place made her shiver. This room, with its eerie silence, had now become her cage. But the criminal did not stop there. He turned to look at Jeanette with a cold, calculating gaze, a twisted grin spreading across his face. Without saying a word, he began his brutal assault on her. Each minute dragged on like an eternity, and for a 9-year-old girl, the physical pain mixed with the psychological horror, making every second feel like an inescapable nightmare. After nearly an hour, when Jeanette thought she could endure no more, he suddenly stood up and dragged her toward a small bathroom in the corner of the room. The white-tiled walls were stained and faded to a grimy gray, and inside was a rusty shower head that looked as though it had been forgotten by time. He sneered, took Jeanette's hand, and used a piece of rope to tie her wrist tightly to the shower head. The cold water came rushing out, soaking her. The icy water jolted Jeanette awake from her pain-induced haze, only to leave her shivering from the numbing cold that seeped into her bones. For a moment, Jeanette didn't know how she should feel. Was this a rare moment of respite between the torment, or yet another form of torture he had devised? She closed her eyes, feeling the cold water trickle through her clothes and skin, silently wondering if this was the safest place she could find in this nightmare of a house. Jeanette couldn't stop thinking, why is he doing this? What does he want from me? Why me? But instead of finding any answers, she only heard the sound of water trickling and the sinister laugh of her abductor echoing from somewhere in the distance, reminding her that this nightmare was far from over.
Like, I started to break down and cry, and that was my only safe place, was the shower, because every time he left me in the shower was when he didn't touch me, he wouldn't hurt me, or he wouldn't rape me.
Police, searching for clues and evidence in vain. While Jeanette was being taken to the attacker's house and subjected to horrific acts, the police had begun their investigation. At that time, the criminal investigator assigned to Jeanette's case was Heather, an elite police officer in California. Although she was a woman, Heather was highly capable and experienced in handling serious cases. Upon arriving at the crime scene, Heather collected blood samples throughout the house and initiated the investigation with the help of sniffer dogs and their handlers. Unfortunately, despite thoroughly searching the house, no traces of the perpetrator's blood were found. Even bodily fluids that might have been present due to the assault on Jeanette were missing. The perpetrator had been meticulous in erasing all evidence. Moreover, Jeanette lived in an area where very few homes were equipped with surveillance cameras. However, the police did manage to locate a small security camera installed at a neighbor's house. The CCTV footage captured the intruder breaking into Jeanette's home, followed by her mother and brother screaming for help. But as you might guess, the footage was of such poor quality that the police could not identify the kidnapper's face. In the end, the police could only conclude one thing: the criminal had planned his crime meticulously. The perpetrator knew that Jeanette would be the first to arrive home and the exact time her mother would return. He even knew the location of her bedroom and broke in through her window, which was the farthest point from the front door of the house. With gloves on his hands and his face concealed, the attack seemed almost like the execution of a perfect plan. Psychological warfare through media. Officer Heather, who was in charge of the case at the time, came to a conclusion. The only thing I can do is publicize Jeanette's case by any means necessary. Heather immediately organized a press conference to brief reporters about Jeanette. This information was broadcast hourly across all local government agencies. The messages conveyed were heart-wrenching. Jeanette, you can survive. We are searching for you. So, don't give up. The family also began searching for Jeanette through a series of public speaking events. Heather's reason for employing this method was straightforward. The perpetrator left no evidence, so instead of solely focusing on finding him, they aimed to send a psychological message to create pressure on him. Flyers were distributed across every corner of the town. Of course, Jeanette, who was being held captive by her abductor, heard these broadcasts every day.
In the morning, he was watching the news again. My cousin was talking to me through the news. She was saying, "Jeanette, if you can hear us, just know that. Be strong, girl. We're looking for you." She was like, "Just don't give up." That gave me hope. That gave me the strength. Either I'm going to fight to get out of here or die trying.
Jeanette regained hope and started planning her escape. Despite the daily torment she endured, her legs bleeding and her body in constant pain, Jeanette thought, "I need to talk to him. I need to earn his trust." On the 5th day of her captivity, Jeanette, still subjected to the abuser's assaults, spoke to him with the brightest smile she could muster. "Where are you from, sir?" The perpetrator looked at Jeanette suspiciously. Jeanette met his gaze and smiled again, trying to appear as innocent as possible. "Please, can you get me a glass of water?" For the first time, the abductor smiled. He left the room to get water. The moment he walked out, Jeanette's mind raced back to the detective series she watched every day. She began thinking about the types of clues detectives typically searched for. In her desperation, Jeanette quickly grabbed the abductor's watch and picked up several red toys scattered around the room. Then she ran to the bathroom, grabbed some toilet paper, and used it to smear traces of her bodily fluids from her underwear onto those items. This was the act of a 9-year-old girl who wanted to ensure her abductor would face justice, even if it cost her life. Afterward, she returned to the bed and sat down, placing the evidence she had gathered in a messy pile to make it look like mere trash. Moments later, the abductor returned with the water. Jeanette had only one thought racing through her mind. "Please, don't touch me." She trembled more than usual, but tried her best to hide it. She understood that if she shook too much, the perpetrator would become suspicious. The final pizza and the day of return. 10 days had passed since Jeanette's disappearance. By this time, she had become numb to the abuse inflicted by her captor. Her focus had shifted entirely to escaping. Over the 10 days, Jeanette's efforts to build trust with her abductor were finally paying off. After assaulting her, though less violently than usual, her captor asked, "Are you hungry?" Jeanette nodded. The man gave her his home address and instructed her to use his mobile phone to call a pizza restaurant and order a pizza. The call to the pizzeria that you saw at the beginning of this video was that very call. Soon, the pizza was delivered. The man took it, placed it in front of Jeanette, and smiled cruelly when he noticed the missing person flyer with Jeanette's face on the pizza box. He sneered, "Enjoy your meal. After you finish, you're going to die." After saying this, he left the room. Jeanette ate a few slices to regain her strength and carefully placed all the evidence she had collected into the pizza box. Then she hid it under the bed, thinking, "Even if I die, you'll still be caught." Hours later, as dawn approached, the man entered the room where Jeanette was sleeping. He began washing her, scrubbing off any remaining traces of himself that could serve as evidence. Then, he placed a terrifying weapon in front of her and stared at it for a long time, deep in thought. Jeanette trembled with fear. After what seemed like an eternity, the man unexpectedly tied her up with a rope and took her to his car. He drove onto the highway. Jeanette tried to memorize every road and turn, even though she was bound in a position that made it difficult to observe her surroundings. After driving for about an hour, the car stopped at a rest area near a bar. The man looked at Jeanette, who nodded fearfully, and then he released her from the car, before disappearing. Initially, his plan had been to kill Jeanette. But why did he spare her life? The reason lay in the widespread broadcasts and the flyers distributed throughout the city. These efforts had created a psychological pressure on him, making him paranoid that someone might be watching him at all times. This mounting fear ultimately led him to release Jeanette rather than kill her, As soon as the man drove away, Jeanette mustered all her strength and ran into a nearby store. The people inside immediately recognized her. Seeing Jeanette, naked and terrified, rushing in, someone exclaimed, "Are you the little girl from the TV?" A man sitting at the counter handed her a phone. Jeanette called the police, who quickly arrived at her location. Among them was Officer Heather, the lead investigator on her case. Heather rushed to Jeanette. The girl, barely able to move her legs, climbed into the police car. The officers reassured her, "We'll catch him. Let's get you to the hospital." But Jeanette insisted that they apprehend her captor immediately. Heather made a swift decision to mobilize an elite SWAT team to raid the man's house. While riding in the police car, Jeanette drew a detailed map of the house's layout from memory. Based on her sketch, the SWAT team executed the raid and captured the perpetrator, who was hiding in the attic. Who was he? The criminal was Alvarez, a seemingly ordinary middle-aged man with no prior criminal record. At the time of his arrest, he brazenly denied all charges and claimed, "Go ahead and look for evidence. You won't find any." However, when the police presented the evidence Jeanette had hidden under the bed, the abductor was visibly shocked. He had believed he had meticulously covered his tracks and left no room for error. In the face of this undeniable proof, he was left speechless. The investigation proceeded smoothly, and Alvarez eventually confessed to all charges, as overwhelming evidence of his crimes came to light. He was ultimately convicted on 9 counts and sentenced to life in prison. Though the perpetrator had been caught, the scars on Jeanette's life remained. Medical examinations revealed that due to the abuse she endured, she would never be able to have children. For 6 years following the ordeal, until the age of 15, Jeanette was too terrified to leave her house, let alone attend school. Detective Heather, the lead investigator on her case, played a crucial role in Jeanette's recovery. Heather visited Jeanette whenever she could, bringing along her fellow CSI detectives to spend time laughing and bonding with her. Did these efforts make a difference? The answer is a resounding yes. Remarkably, Jeanette is now 30 years old and has become a police officer herself. She works tirelessly to protect at-risk teenagers in the Hayland area, aiming to prevent others from becoming victims like she once was. Jeanette is a symbol of strength, intelligence, and courage, a woman who not only saved herself from the brink of death, but also ensured her abuser faced justice. It makes one wonder, how many people possess the calmness and resilience of this brave girl?